You must let my people go, or ruin will befall Egypt.
Sometime around 1880 BC, in a throne room in the ancient Egyptian city of Memphis, a 30-year-old foreigner stood before the most powerful man on earth and told him that his entire civilization was about to collapse. And then he told him exactly what to do about it. Pharaoh listened. He took the ring from his own hand. He placed it on the foreigner's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck, set him in the chariot that rode directly behind his own, and announced to every province in Egypt that nothing in the entire kingdom would move without this man's approval. The foreigner's name was Joseph. He was a Hebrew from Canaan. He had arrived in Egypt 13 years earlier in chains, sold by his own brothers for 20 pieces of silver to a caravan of Midianite traders moving south toward the Nile Delta. He spoke Egyptian with an accent. He had no land, no family, no allies, no capital, and no legal status in the country that would eventually make him the most powerful administrator the ancient world had ever produced. What happened in the 14 years between the slave market and the throne room is one of the greatest case studies in counter-cyclical asset strategy, information asymmetry, sovereign wealth construction, and multi-generational financial architecture ever recorded. And the fact that most people encounter it only in Sunday school, stripped of its economic scaffolding, reduced to a story about a colorful coat and a reunion in the desert, is the most expensive misreading in the history of financial education. This is not a sermon. This is a forensic reconstruction of a macroeconomic strategy that controlled the food supply of the entire known world for 7 years, transferred the land ownership of an entire nation to the crown in a legally documented transaction, established a permanent sovereign revenue structure that the historical record confirms endured for generations, and was engineered entirely by a man who started the decade with nothing. Stay with me, because the principles embedded in Genesis chapters 41 through 47 are not ancient history. They are the oldest written playbook for building generational wealth during a global contraction that has ever been set down on paper. And right now, in the economy you are living through today, every single principle in it is operational. Joseph's story begins not in Egypt, but in a dry pit in the hill country of Canaan, where a 17-year-old boy had just been thrown by his brothers and left to die. His father Jacob had given him a coat. In the ancient Near East, a coat of many colors was not a fashion statement. It was a transfer of birthright. It was the outer garment of the firstborn, the visible sign that the one wearing it would inherit the patriarch's position, his property, his covenant authority. Jacob had 12 sons. He had chosen the 11th to wear the coat. His 10 older brothers understood exactly what that meant. They hated him for it. And one afternoon, when Jacob sent Joseph to check on them in the fields near Dothan, they stripped the coat off his back, threw him into a dry cistern, sat down to eat their lunch, and then sold him to passing traders for 20 silver shekels. 20 silver shekels. That was the going market rate for a male slave between the ages of 5 and 20 in the ancient Near East, confirmed by Assyrian merchant records from the same general period. The brothers had priced him correctly. They knew the market. What they did not know, and what the entire subsequent story turns on, is that they had just liquidated the most strategically capable asset in their family at the exact bottom of his value. The traders took Joseph south to Egypt. In Egypt, they sold him again, this time to a man named Potiphar, an officer in Pharaoh's household guard, a senior military administrator with access to the palace and the palace's accounts. This is where the pattern that will define Joseph's entire career first becomes visible. And it is a pattern that the text of Genesis records with extraordinary precision, because the writer understood that it was the mechanism behind everything that followed. Genesis 39, verses 2 through 4. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. Read those verses as an operational description and not as a theological statement. And what you find is a three-stage process that Joseph will repeat in every environment he enters for the next 13 years. Stage 1. He produces measurable results in the constrained environment he has been placed in. He does not wait for a favorable environment. He does not petition for better circumstances. He optimizes what is in front of him until the results are undeniable. Stage 2. The person above him notices the results and extends trust incrementally. Potiphar does not hand Joseph the keys to everything on day one. He watches, he tests, he promotes in stages as the evidence accumulates. Stage 3. The person above him delegates so completely that Joseph effectively runs the operation while the nominal authority figure removes himself from day-to-day management. Genesis 39:6 says Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, and with Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. This is the oldest documented description of what modern management theory calls total operational delegation. Potiphar had become the chairman, and Joseph was functioning as the CEO. He had achieved this without a title change, without a formal promotion process, simply by being so reliably effective that removing him from that position would have been operationally destructive. Then Potiphar's wife made a false accusation. Joseph refused her repeated advances because he understood something that very few people in positions of rising influence understand at the moment they are rising. He understood that the integrity of the system he was building mattered more than the comfort of the present moment. He said to her in Genesis 39:9, "My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" He was not protecting himself. He was protecting the trust structure that Potiphar had extended to him. Because Joseph understood at some level that the only asset he actually possessed in that environment was his track record of trustworthiness. Strip away the coat and the chains and the cell and the palace later. What Joseph was building across every environment he entered was a single reputation. The reputation of a man to whom you could hand everything and know it would be returned intact and increased. When the false accusation landed him in prison, he did not rage against the injustice. He did not collapse into despair. He entered the prison, and within a measurable period of time, he was running it. Genesis 39:22 through 23. The warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care. This is now the second time in the narrative that a person of authority in Joseph's life has removed himself from active management because Joseph's management was so reliable that oversight was unnecessary. In Potiphar's house, the master did not concern himself with anything except what he ate. In the prison, the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care. This is not luck. This is not divine intervention described as luck. This is a repeatable operational pattern, a specific approach to every environment that produces the same result across two completely different contexts. And it produces that result because the pattern is structurally sound, independent of the specific environment. Modern private equity has a name for what Joseph was demonstrating. They call it management alpha, the excess return generated by the quality of a manager above and beyond the underlying asset quality. You can give two managers the same distressed asset, and one of them will generate returns that the other cannot, because the manager is the variable. Joseph was demonstrating management alpha in a pit, in a slave market, in a household, and in a prison, before he ever had an asset worth managing. 2 years into his prison sentence, Pharaoh had 2 dreams in the same night. 7 fat cattle rising from the Nile, followed by 7 thin cattle that devoured them. 7 full heads of grain on a single stalk, followed by 7 withered heads that swallowed them. He woke from both dreams shaken. He called his magicians, his wise men, every interpreter in the palace. None of them could unlock the dreams. A cupbearer who had spent time in that prison remembered a young Hebrew who had interpreted his own dream with an accuracy that could only be described as structural knowledge about the future. He mentioned Joseph to Pharaoh. Joseph was brought from the prison, shaved, because the Egyptians considered facial hair deeply offensive. And the text's mention of this detail is one of the markers historians use to argue Joseph served a native Egyptian pharaoh rather than the Hyksos, changed his clothing, and brought before the throne. What happened in that throne room is the moment the entire case study turns on. Pharaoh told Joseph his dreams. Joseph listened. And then Joseph did something that no one else in that room had done. Not the magicians, not the wise men, not the advisors who had been sitting in that hall for decades. He did not just interpret the dreams. He presented a policy response. This distinction is everything. An interpreter gives you information. A strategist gives you information and a deployment framework. Joseph was not performing a talent. He was demonstrating a competency. And Pharaoh, who had sat through enough courtly performance from his advisors to know the difference between a man who could name a problem and a man who could solve one, recognized immediately what he was looking at. Genesis 41, 25 through 32. Joseph told Pharaoh, "The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. It is just as I said to Pharaoh." God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The plenty will not be remembered in the land, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. Then, in Genesis 41:33, without being asked, Joseph said, "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man, and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. 20%. During the 7 years of abundance, held in cities as distributed infrastructure, under sovereign authority, reserved for the 7 years of contraction. This is the complete architecture of a counter-cyclical sovereign wealth fund described in 5 sentences in 1880 BC. And it contains every principle that the most sophisticated institutional investors on Earth deploy today. Counter-cyclical acquisition. Buying during the peak to build reserves for the trough, rather than buying during the trough when everyone else is also trying to buy, and prices have already moved. Distributed infrastructure, storing not in one central location where a single point of failure could destroy the entire reserve, but in every city from the surrounding fields, so that distribution costs in the famine years would be minimized and geographic failure could not cascade into total system failure. Sovereign authority. Ensuring the reserve was under Pharaoh's direct control, so that neither private accumulation by elites nor market pricing could access the reserve before the crisis hit. And fixed percentage collection, 20%, not a variable amount, not subject to renegotiation year by year, codified so that the commissioners implementing it had a clear mandate that could not be diluted by political pressure during the abundance years when the sacrifice of 20% felt large and unnecessary. Pharaoh looked around the room. He had advisors with decades of experience in Egyptian governance. He had military commanders who had conducted campaigns across the Levant. He had priests with direct connections to every major temple in Egypt. And he said in Genesis 41:38 through 39, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you." He was not being polite. He was making an operational assessment. He had just heard a foreign slave who arrived from a prison cell present a macroeconomic strategy that was so structurally sound, so specific, so immediately actionable, that it made every trained advisor in that hall look like they were operating at a lower cognitive level. The ring came off Pharaoh's hand. The robe went on Joseph's back. The gold chain went around his neck. The chariot was waiting. And Genesis 41:43 records that they shouted before him, "Bow the knee." Every person Joseph passed on the road, from the palace to his first administrative task, had been instructed to bow. 30 years old, 13 years after the pit. Chief operating officer of the most powerful empire on earth. Now watch what he does with it. The most important economic decisions Joseph made during the 7 years of abundance were not the ones he made at the national level. They were the ones he made at the infrastructure level. Genesis 41:48 says he collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In every city he laid up the food from the fields surrounding it. Every city, from the surrounding fields, not from a central collection point that then redistributed to cities. From the local fields directly into local storage. This is distributed supply chain design. The food traveled the shortest possible distance from production to storage. The scribes who monitored it were managing local inventory, not a vast central bureaucracy. The commissioners who collected the 20% were accountable to local governors who were accountable to Joseph's central office. The physical evidence for this system exists. Archaeologists from the University of Chicago, excavating at Tel Edfu, an ancient provincial capital on the Upper Nile between Luxor and Aswan, uncovered 7 massive circular mud brick silos in a central courtyard. They are the largest known storage structures from ancient Egypt. The University of Chicago team described the scale as a surprise, unlike anything found before in Egyptian archaeology. The silos were built together, accessible from the city center, scaled for mass intake and distribution, rather than for elite storage. This is not one central royal granary in Memphis. This is municipal food infrastructure built to absorb an entire province's surplus and hold it intact until the distribution phase. Genesis 41:49 says Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. A man who had recently been a slave in a country where scribes recorded every basket of grain on clay tablets stopped keeping records. Not because he had become careless, because the number had exceeded the administrative capacity of the available recording system. He had generated more grain under sovereign control than the most sophisticated bureaucracy in the ancient world could count. That is the result of 7 years of 20% sovereign collection during the peak of a productivity cycle. Before the first famine year arrived, Egypt held food reserves that surpassed the measurement capacity of its own accounting infrastructure. And then, year 8 arrived. The dreams had said 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine, so severe that the abundance would be forgotten. This is exactly what happened. Genesis 41:53 through 54. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. In all the other lands, not just in Egypt's neighboring regions, in all the other lands. The famine that Genesis describes was not a local crop failure. It was a regional collapse affecting every agricultural civilization around the eastern Mediterranean simultaneously. The climatological record from the Bronze Age Middle Kingdom period confirms that the region experienced extended periods of reduced Nile flooding correlated with broader Mediterranean drought cycles. The failure was real. The geography of the failure was real. And the scope of Joseph's advantage was directly proportional to the geography of the failure. Egypt had food, nobody else did, and Joseph had bought it all. Genesis 41:56 through 57. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. All the world. Egypt had become the only solvent counterparty in a global liquidity crisis. Every other nation's reserves were at zero. Egypt's were so full they could not be counted, and Joseph held the keys. This is what Warren Buffett means when he describes wanting to own the toll booth, not the truck that has to pay to cross the bridge. Joseph did not just own the grain. He owned the only gate through which the known world could access food during a 7-year period in which there was no other gate. The buying power flowed in from Canaan, from Sinai, from Libya, from what Genesis 42 calls all the countries. The foreign delegations that arrived with whatever portable wealth their nations could assemble, trading silver and goods for food that had no substitute and no competing source. Among those foreign delegations was one that Joseph recognized the moment they walked through the gate. 10 men from Canaan, older than when he had last seen them, road-worn, desperate, bowing low before the governor of Egypt to beg for grain. His brothers, the ones who had priced him at 20 shekels and sold him to the Midianites and told their father he was dead. Joseph did not reveal himself, not yet. He conducted the transaction as a governor, not as a brother. He tested them over 2 visits spanning months. He needed to know whether the men who had sold him were still capable of the same betrayal, or whether something had changed in them across the years of consequence they had lived through since that afternoon in the field at Dothan. What he found across those 2 visits was that they were not. They had spent years carrying a guilt they could not put down. When Joseph engineered a scenario that gave them the opportunity to abandon his youngest brother Benjamin to Egyptian custody and return home safely, they refused. Judah offered himself in Benjamin's place. He stood before the governor of Egypt and gave a speech recorded in Genesis 44 that is one of the most articulate expressions of transformed moral character in all of ancient literature. Joseph wept. He cleared the room of every Egyptian official. And he said to his brothers in Genesis 45, 4-8, "I am Joseph your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. He had just absorbed 13 years of slavery, false accusation, imprisonment, and systemic injustice into a single theological framework that recontextualized every one of those years as necessary positioning for the outcome that had just arrived. He was not performing forgiveness. He was declaring a long arc understanding of how the worst things that had happened to him had been the mechanism that put him in the only position from which he could save everyone, including the people who had destroyed his early life. This is the human center of the entire strategy, and it is the part that cannot be replicated by algorithm or replicated by capital alone. The thing that made Joseph capable of running the food supply of the ancient world was not only his administrative competence, it was his internal accounting of what had happened to him. His refusal to let betrayal become bitterness, his refusal to let injustice become passivity, his refusal to be defined by the worst thing that had been done to him. Every constrained environment he entered with the same orientation. He looked for what he could build with what was in front of him. He was never performing resilience. He was practicing it every day for 13 years until the practice became indistinguishable from his character. But the economic architecture of the Joseph story does not end with the reunion. The most sophisticated part of what Joseph built comes in Genesis chapter 47. And it is the part that almost no one examines carefully because it requires holding the financial and the moral dimensions of the story in the same frame simultaneously. The famine continued. The Egyptians had spent all their money buying grain from Joseph during the first years of the shortage. Genesis 47:15. When the money of the people of Egypt and Canaan was gone, all Egypt came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? Our money is used up." Joseph's response is not charity. It is not price gouging. It is a structured asset exchange that is documented step by step in the text with the specificity of a legal record. He said in Genesis 47:16, "Then bring your livestock. I will sell you food in exchange for your livestock since your money is gone." They brought their livestock to Joseph, and he gave them food in exchange for their horses, their sheep and goats, their cattle and donkeys. And he brought them through that year with food in exchange for all their livestock. One full agricultural year of Egyptian livestock, horses, flocks, herds, donkeys, transferred to Pharaoh's inventory in exchange for food. The entire private livestock base of Egypt had just moved on to the sovereign balance sheet. The next year, they came back. Genesis 47:18 through 19. They said to Joseph, "We cannot hide from our Lord the fact that since our money is gone and our livestock belongs to you, there is nothing left for our Lord except our bodies and our land. Why should we perish before your eyes, we and our land as well? Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we with our land will be in bondage to Pharaoh. Give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate." They offered it voluntarily, under the pressure of survival, yes, but documented as an offer, not as a seizure. And Joseph's response is recorded in Genesis 47:20 with the precision of a legal transfer of title. Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's. This is the largest documented land acquisition in ancient history. An entire nation's private land base transferred to sovereign ownership through the controlled distribution of a commodity that had been pre-positioned during the peak of the previous abundance cycle, taxed at 20%, stored in distributed municipal infrastructure, and held until the moment of maximum demand and zero alternatives. Joseph did not conquer this land with an army. He bought it with grain that Egypt had grown itself and that he had systematically accumulated while it was cheap and while no one else understood what was coming. The transfer was legal. It was documented. It was witnessed. And it was, from the perspective of the people who entered into it, the transaction that saved their lives. But here is the piece of the Joseph strategy that separates it from simple crisis exploitation. The piece that makes it a multi-generational architecture rather than a one-cycle extraction. Genesis 47:23 through 25. Joseph said to the people, "Now that I have bought you and your land today for Pharaoh, here is seed for you so you can plant the ground. But when the crop comes in, give a fifth of it to Pharaoh. The other 4/5 you may keep as seed for the fields and as food for yourselves and your households and your children." He gave it back, not the ownership. The land remained Pharaoh's, but the use of the land, the ability to work it and benefit from it, he returned to the people who had just transferred it. And the terms he set were not punitive. 4/5 to the producers, 1/5 to the crown. The same 20% he had levied during the abundance years, now codified as a permanent productive arrangement between the sovereign and the working population of Egypt. Genesis 47:26. So Joseph established it as a law concerning land in Egypt, still in force today, that a fifth of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. The scribes wrote it down. It became statute, Egyptian law, recorded and enforceable. The temporary emergency tax that Joseph had used to acquire the land during the crisis had been converted into a permanent revenue structure, built on the productive capacity of the people who worked that land. This is what private equity firms call converting a distressed acquisition into a performing asset. You buy the asset at the bottom of its value when the former owner has no alternatives and must sell. You restructure the operational arrangement so that the asset generates productive returns, and you collect a percentage of those returns in perpetuity, long after the crisis that created the acquisition opportunity has passed. Joseph built an annuity from a famine. And the people of Egypt responded in Genesis 47:25 with words that confirm he had executed the restructuring correctly. They said, "You have saved our lives. May we find favor in the eyes of our Lord. We will be in bondage to Pharaoh." They thanked him. The population that had just transferred their money, their livestock, their land, and their personal freedom to the sovereign crown thanked the man who engineered the transfer, because he had fed them when they had nothing, because he had given them seed to rebuild with, because he had structured the ongoing arrangement as a partnership that left them with enough productive capacity to generate long-term value for themselves and their children. Because the alternative to the 20% arrangement was death, and death has no operating leverage. A crisis predator takes everything at the moment of maximum vulnerability and leaves nothing behind to generate future value. A crisis architect acquires a structural position, leaves the producing population with enough to rebuild, and collects a sustainable percentage of the rebuilding in perpetuity. Joseph was a crisis architect. And Egypt's economy, the historical record suggests, functioned on the 20% structure he built for generations after he was gone. There are three principles embedded in this strategy that are not ancient history. The first, the cycle always turns, and the person who understands the cycle in advance of the market is always positioned above the person who reacts to what is already happening. Joseph knew the famine was coming before anyone else knew. He acted on that knowledge by acquiring commodity infrastructure at the exact bottom of the cost curve, during peak production, when grain was abundant and cheap, and the cost of storage was at its floor. By the time the rest of the world understood what was happening, Joseph's position was so established that the only option available to every other actor in the system was to come to him. Every recession in modern economic history has had its version of this dynamic. The people who held liquidity during the 2008 financial crisis and deployed it into distressed real estate in 2009 and 2010 built positions that generated returns for decades. The people who waited until the recovery was visible, until the risk was apparent, until the cycle had already turned, paid peak prices for assets they could have acquired at the bottom. The Joseph position is always available at the bottom of every cycle. Almost no one takes it because almost no one can see the bottom from inside it. The second principle, information asymmetry is the most durable competitive advantage in any market. Joseph had information that no one else possessed. He understood the nature and duration of the coming contraction before any other actor in the Egyptian system. He used that information not to enrich himself personally, but to build the infrastructure that would make him the only fully stocked counterparty when the contraction arrived. Modern financial markets spend billions of dollars trying to generate edges in information asymmetry that are measured in milliseconds and fractions of a percentage point. Joseph had a 7-year information edge on the food supply of the entire known world. The asymmetry was total. The advantage was absolute. The third principle is the one most people miss because it requires holding a much longer time horizon than most investors are willing to maintain. Joseph did not build a transaction. He built a system. The 20% tax he levied during the boom, then used to acquire Egypt's entire land base during the bust, then converted into a permanent productive arrangement after the crisis. That was not a trade. A trade produces a return, and then it is over. A system produces returns across every subsequent cycle, regardless of which direction the market moves next. The statute that Joseph established in Genesis 47:26, a fifth of the produce belongs to Pharaoh, still in force today as the text records it. That was not 7 years of work generating a one-time return. That was multi-generational institutional infrastructure generating sovereign revenue in perpetuity. The Pharaoh who gave Joseph his ring received one man's brilliant crisis management. The pharaohs who followed received the statute. There is one final layer to the story that requires the most careful attention, because it is the layer that makes the difference between understanding the Joseph strategy as an economic framework and understanding it as something more complete. Joseph did not arrive at any of this through calculation alone. He arrived at it through character, specifically through the character he built across 13 years of circumstances that would have destroyed a man of lesser interior discipline. In every environment he entered, the pit, the slave market, the household, the prison, he made the same choice. He did not allow the injustice of his circumstances to determine the quality of his engagement with those circumstances. He could have become bitter in the pit and arrived in Egypt already broken. He could have become passive in Potiphar's house, doing the minimum required of a slave with no future. He could have become hardened and transactional in the prison, extracting what he could from a situation that had taken everything from him twice. He did none of those things. He administered Potiphar's house as though it were his own. He ran the prison as though it were an institution he cared about. He presented Pharaoh with a policy recommendation when all he had been asked to do was explain a dream. He wept when he saw his brothers, not because of what they had done to him, but because of what they had become in the years since. Men carrying guilt they could not put down, capable of a sacrifice they had not been capable of before. The character was the strategy, or more precisely, the character was what made the strategy possible. Because no one hands the keys to an empire to a man whose interior life they do not trust. Pharaoh gave Joseph the signet ring not because Joseph had a better algorithm than the palace economists. He gave it because Joseph was visibly the kind of man to whom you could give everything and know it would be returned intact and increased. You cannot manufacture that in a throne room. You build it in every constrained environment you are placed in before the throne room arrives. In every situation where cutting corners would be undetected. In every moment where the minimum would be accepted. In every season where no one is watching. And the choice you make in the dark determines the person you are when the lights come on. Joseph built his character in a pit, in a slave market, in a household where he had no legal status, in a prison where he had no timeline for release. He built it without knowing that any of it would ever matter to anyone beyond the walls of whatever space he was currently confined in. And then one morning, Pharaoh had two dreams. And everything Joseph had built, in every constrained environment across 13 years of invisible faithfulness, became the exact qualification that the most powerful position in the ancient world required. The grain is in the silo. Every recession is a grain silo that most people do not know how to fill. The cycle is always turning. The 7 fat years are always followed by 7 lean years. The person who understands the cycle in advance and positions accordingly will always be the only solvent counterparty when the contraction arrives. The person with the liquidity, the infrastructure, the long-time horizon, and the character that earns complete trust will always be the one Pharaoh calls for when the dreams will not stop coming. Joseph did not get lucky. He was ready. And the question the book of Genesis asks across 14 chapters, from the pit at Dothan, to the throne room in Memphis, to the reunion in the grain market, to the statute that outlived him, is the same question it is asking you right now. What are you doing with the constrained environment you are currently in? Because the throne room is always further away than it looks, and always closer than you think.